Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable, carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe, and thank you for joining the conversation today. As we enter 2024, closing the books on 2023's record heat, economic and geopolitical turmoil, and a raft of climate change stories in the mainstream press, we're fortunate to have Project Censored's Andy Lee Roth return to the show to discuss the most underreported environmental stories of last year. Andy is the Associate Director of Project Censored and last visited with us to discuss 2022's underreported stories. You know, it used to be the case that only sites like Earth911 wrote about the ways to reduce our environmental impact. But now the mainstream press has responded to rising public concern with more of that kind of practical information. They've assigned sustainability as a beat, and they've hired columnists to deliver action-oriented articles. But at the same time, they do not necessarily do the enterprise reporting required to uncover major companies' and governments' environmental abuses. And smaller publications don't have the resources needed to support investigative research. So we're getting more attention to the climate crisis, but not enough digging into the continuing sources and causes of the climate crisis. From misleading research funded by private companies to the lack of oversight of new products and chemicals like per and poly-fluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, the forever chemicals that are in our water and even in our bodies. Those are the kinds of stories that have been underreported, and we're going to talk about them today. The news is what we make it. And unfortunately, in this era of transactional politics, the news is often only what we are willing to pay for, and that can create closed spaces in which our biases and our assumptions are not challenged because we're reading things that only confirm them. Now more than ever, an independent press is necessary. So let's see what publications are doing the important work of breaking major climate and environmental stories. You can learn more about Project Censored and the underreported stories of 2023 at projectcensored.org. Project Censored is all one word, no space, no dash. Now let's get to the conversation. Welcome to the show, Andy, or rather, welcome back. How you doing?
It's great to be with you again, Mitch. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, you guys every year do really important work, but I want to start off with a question. You know, we're entering 2024 and AI is everywhere.
Yeah.
It's in search sites, and that may be beginning to obscure the breadth and damage related to climate change because it picks out from the majority of information on the web key trends or key information, and a lot of that is false. So now that AI is designed to keep readers on the search site, you know, give them the answer and let them move on the way, how can people avoid being caught in AI created bubbles of information? What can people do to stay out of that?
Before I answer the question directly, let me background it a little bit.
Sure.
Because this is something that Mickey Huff, the project's director, and I write about in the introduction to the State of the Free Press yearbook. This newly developing phenomena promoted by social media and the very dynamic you're talking about, Mitch, this phenomena of news finds me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of perception, or we should probably say misperception, that as long as we're connected by social media, any important news will come to me through my feed.
Yeah.
And there have been studies. This has been a phenomenon long enough that we have studies, we have fairly good evidence to show that that news finds me perception is indeed a misperception. A 2017 study that looked at people with that news finds me attitude and news finds me practices in terms of their news and media consumption habits tended to overestimate how well-informed they were, and they tended to be less well-informed, in fact, than their counterparts who are doing the kinds of things I'm about to recommend now. So, you know, I don't think I would say, oh, well, just, you know, dump your account, your social media accounts. They're useful in their own ways. But I would definitely say don't rely on them as your primary source of news and information, because as you noted in setting this question up, Mitch, those feeds, those social media feeds are largely dictated by algorithms, We don't know the exact contents of those algorithms because Meta and Microsoft and Google and you name the big tech company all consider their algorithms to be proprietary material, and therefore, and they've resisted actively in courts efforts to have those algorithms brought out into the open, if not publicly, at least made available to third-party evaluators to check for baked-in biases. They've resisted that. And so basically, like, it's another, I think it's one of many cases where we trade convenience for control, right? Or autonomy. And when you rely on an algorithmically generated news feed to keep you informed, you're at the mercy of the algorithm. And however it's been programmed to promote some things and either sideline or blockade altogether other types of content or other sources of content. And we know also, this is part of the work I do with Project Censored, we track these things. We know that a number of independent news outlets have been systemically shadow banned, demonetized, etc., by platforms like YouTube and others. And so that news finds me, there are lots of problems with our journalism today, and the news finds me is one on the demand side. It's something that we as people who need to be informed to be active in our communities can do something about directly ourselves by not increasing our reliance on that algorithmically generated content. So I think to come back to a very direct answer to your question that I've indirectly woven around to, one thing is simply to subscribe directly to newsletters or publications from the news outlets that you know and trust. And by subscribing directly to them, you cut out that algorithmic middleman.
Even if we don't understand how the algorithms work, we do know that if you pack the net with false information, those algorithms are going to pick it up. So, and that's clearly been a strategy used by the fossil fuel industry to prevent us from really embracing the reality that burning fossil fuels is what's driving the climate crisis. So, but you also suggest something that is fraught with peril, which is the sources we trust. How would you assess a source to determine whether or not you trust it?
Yeah, that's a I don't know, I probably need to adjust for inflation here, a $10,000 question, I think. I think one of the keys is to not think in terms of outlets per se, but to think in terms of the quality of the individual report itself. And it's much easier. This is what we teach in our critical media literacy curriculum in classrooms across the country, is to a few things that are fairly easy to do to assess the quality and validity of particular stories. And so for me, one of the biggest one is to look at who the reporter's sources are for that story. And when you see a story about climate change where all the sources are either Congress people or spokespeople for big corporations, you might immediately begin to suspect there's more to this story than is being reported here in this article, right?
Like the phrase "scientists say," you know, rather than the scientists name their institution and so forth is the kind of thing that I would look for instance.
Yeah, that and definitely then like that points to a kind of a second kind of thing where again, I think this is kind of like critical media literacy 101. It takes more time to do, but again, it leaves you with more, it leaves each person who does take the time to do it with more of a sense of control over what kind of news we're allowing to influence our perspectives. Tracking back sources, right? So a lot of what the news we're reading now is online, which makes it even easier to do that than it would have been in the past. They're often, a well-sourced article will have hyperlinks that take you back to the peer-reviewed journal article that's being cited as evidence for whatever the claim is made, and you can check that. And oftentimes those those peer-reviewed articles have information about what, if any, conflicts of interest the authors of that study may have. Now, of course, we're at the mercy of honest and fair appraisal of what constitutes a conflict, but there's more, right? If you go back and see, like, oh, well, this claim is based on Andy's blog, and Andy says the moon is made of green cheese because his mom told him so, then you might say, that's not a trustworthy source. I'm going to read this article with some skepticism.
Exactly. Now, one of your underreported stories this year is the influence of fossil fuel money on research. How do I know when I read a peer-reviewed research report that researcher wasn't paid by fossil fuel interests to cast the question in a way that it's going to find a benign outcome for the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, that unfortunately, that has become that area of gray uncertainty is becoming wider due to the influence of fossil fuel money on university climate and energy research. This is a story that was broken in March of this year in The Guardian, also in The Nation, based on a study that was produced by Data for Progress, a progressive think tank. And just, I can get to the heart of the story by just quoting part of The Guardian's report. Mm-hmm. Fossil fuel firms have purposely sought to colonize academia with industry-friendly science rather than cede overt climate denial. So there's been a shift in tactics now, right? For a long time, big oil and other and ancillary industries dependent on fossil fuel all sought to just outright deny that climate change had human causes with links to their products. Now the shift is to colonize academic research with a kind of industry-friendly science. The study that this is based on looked at 27 universities over a 10-year period and found that those universities received some $667 million in fossil fuel donations during that period. These are some of the most prestigious institutions in the country: UC Berkeley, George Mason University, Stanford, UT Austin, MIT, Princeton, Rice, Harvard. They're all receiving significant amounts of money. In that one decade, UC Berkeley received a total of $154 million in funding.
And as we've learned, universities are not particularly ethical in a variety of ways when it comes to money. Admissions, we've seen a number of really disturbing trends there. Is there a way for us to, as citizens, particularly, let's say, citizens of the state of California, to ask for the state university system to stop doing that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think political pressure is always useful and calls for oversight. Of course, it pains me to say this, but we're at a time where public trust in universities is already low and diminished. And I think that's the result of overt and tacit efforts by conservatives to undermine university credibility. So this is a kind of crisis, I think, because historically we've turned to university researchers, scholarly inquiry as a depoliticized way of making sense of things. And I know that statement I made is fraught with historical exceptions. Educational institutions are not always liberatory, even if their rhetoric is. But by and large, I think we're seeing, this is evidence of a shift in how science is done that is deeply troubling, right? And so I think, to put a positive spin on this, it's independent news outlets that are alerting us, that are in effect sounding the alarm bell that this is an issue. When we researched this story for inclusion in this year's book, we found little to no corporate news coverage of the Data for Progress report at all. There has, the Guardian and the Nation helped focus public attention on this to some extent, but the nation's most prominent newspapers haven't really covered this as news. We found examples of opinion articles, or if they're prominent newspapers, sometimes there's an online article, but not in the print version of the paper. And so there's a kind of marginalization of this story in the corporate press that is also part of the problem. And in terms of where I focus my attention and research, that's one way in on this, is we need better news coverage of this, because without that news coverage, the public ire to perhaps engage in the kind of political mobilization that you're suggesting for greater accountability just won't be there. And that, of course, serves the people making these donations on behalf of fossil fuel interests. They would rather this wasn't a big public issue.
Well, and ultimately, we won't be able to always discern a donation on behalf of the fossil fuel industry, because it could be an individual who is not clearly associated with it, or at least is insulated in some way, maybe through a foundation.
Yeah, although yes, that's true. But in this case, what the research was showing is that, these are basically organizations that are acting on behalf of ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, you name them, or in some cases, like Koch Industries, right? So the funding in this case is, and this is part of what makes the study, I think, both that it was doable, but also that it's so compelling, is like this is like pretty direct access. And again, the upshot of this is, as the nation, I think this is such a damning characterization from the nation's report on this. The aim is to skew the results, the timing, and the presentation of scientific research. So it's a direct attack on something that, if you believe there are kind of pillars of democracy, that, in other words, institutions that hold up a democratic society, along with journalism, I would put science right up there, right? It's because it's fundamentally based in the idea of we're trying to understand reality.
Well, and we used to try to understand reality really kind of as a public good. The news organizations used to be a loss leader for media companies. Now they have to earn their keep too. That started, very clearly in the late 80s. But in that environment of a transactional research infrastructure, we face a lot of challenges. Now, one of the organizations that clearly is doing a good job, because they are cited over and over in your reports, is The Guardian.
Yeah.
And I want to turn to another story that they've covered, which is the unreported toxic spills. The United States, between April 2020 and February 2023, had roughly one toxic spill incident every 2 days. But we only heard about the really big ones. So the question I was thinking as I was reading this is the wall-to-wall coverage of major spills hiding the real and dire frequency of toxic releases into the environment generally?
Yeah. I think that's an accurate analysis, and it jibes with something that I'll just sidetrack for a moment here. All our stories that make the top 25 list every year are the result of a year-long process where we review, and each story that's a candidate, if it makes it to the kind of final stages, undergoes like 5 separate stages of review. The final stages of which involve the project's panel of international judges who are experts in media. Many of them are editors, journalists themselves, media scholars. One of them, and the reason I'm talking about this now, is a person named Bob Hackett, who founded Newswatch Canada. Bob's been one of the project's judges for a long time, and in a book he published longer ago than I want to acknowledge now, he has this great observation about corporate news. In a book called The Missing News, Bob Hackett says, for corporate news media, news is what went wrong today, not what goes wrong every day. And so this story about the derailment furor that arose when the Norfolk Southern train derailed in February of last year outside of East Palestine, Ohio. That eventually got round-the-clock coverage as this catastrophic disaster. CNN, Fox, other complete establishment news outlets focused attention on the accident, but they didn't report at all, as you've suggested, the frequency with which these chemical spills occur and the danger of basically routine chemical releases to millions of Americans. So this is, I think, a perfect example of what Bob Hackett was talking about. These things are happening every day. As you said, according to the Coalition to Prevent Chemical Disasters, 470 toxic chemical releases between April of 2020 and February of 2023. A lot of those are not involving rail accidents like the East Palestine disaster did. They're occurring at facilities where these chemicals are either produced or stored. The Government Accountability Office.
We're always told they're safe and operate reliably, and they don't.
Yeah. The Government Accountability Office has estimated there are about 12,000 of those facilities. Yeah. And that based on where those are located, there are about 200 million Americans who are at, in the words of the the GAO report, are at regular risk of accidental exposure to dangerous chemicals. And the kicker on that, of course, is that many of those communities are predominantly people of color or in some ways disadvantaged, and they're the most exposed. So I think part of the problem here is, again, as I said before, this story is in our list this year because it didn't receive any kind of significant establishment news media coverage. You had to, if you don't read The Guardian, you might not know about this story. The other component of this is, of course, the industry lobbying. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has been trying to establish more stringent regulations on these facilities where chemicals are stored and manufactured. And those efforts at stepping up regulation have been opposed systemically by industry lobbyists, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Chemistry Council, and the American Petroleum Institute. So these are cases where business interests are overriding and undermining public health concerns.
I was talking with a news director friend of mine the other day, and he mentioned the fact that he really was feeling sort of culpable over the past 50 years for having focused on those big stories. The East Palestine spill was covered largely because there was a big plume of smoke.
Yeah.
But what he ultimately said is it doesn't allow the viewer the ability to judge the relative importance or impact of any individual story because of exactly what you called out a moment ago. It's the stuff that goes wrong every day rather than the one-off events, the disasters that happen on a particular day that define the environment in which we live. And so as we think about this, you've mentioned The Guardian. What other publications do you believe are the most reliable in terms of surfacing these stories?
Well, one that I'm a huge fan of, and so this is me speaking personally now and not on behalf of the project, because I wouldn't want to single out one at the expense of others.
And there are a lot doing good work.
I mean, I think that's a wonderful problem for us to have, right? The challenge is that each of those organizations, and I'll answer the question in a moment, each of those organizations is relatively small in comparison to, say, the reach and influence of a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal or some of the network and cable news televisions. And so the challenge, I think, is and this is something that Peter Phillips, who was the director of the project when I first became involved, he always talked about we need to validate these independent news outlets, validate them in the sense of let members of the public know that they're out there and they're trustworthy and they deserve our support and attention. One I would put up there is High Country News.
Mhm.
I was talking earlier about like just following organizations directly rather than through a social media feed. And um, I'll just make a shameless plug for High Country News, which I have no financial interest in. I just think they do a great job. They put out a beautiful magazine, a beautiful and informative magazine every month
Yeah.
that has stories I don't see anywhere else. And a subscription to the print edition doesn't actually cost very much at all. I think an introductory subscription is something like $20 a year. And so I would put in a plug for that, for High Country News to be on people's radar, especially for those of us living out in the kind of the broadly defined the American West.
Yeah.
But I think it's relevant for anyone in the United States. They do an especially good job of reporting on issues facing rural communities, and we do know that so much of the kind of corporate news media is very city-centric and urban-centric in its focus. But I would also say anyone interested in kind of news outlets, it's a happily difficult task to say there's so many wonderful independent news outlets out there now. And I think the trick is connecting people as people who are hungry for significant, meaningful news and not junk food news, connecting them with those outlets. We have a resource on the Project Censored website that was originally developed for the students and faculty who identify and vet the stories that become candidates for our annual top 25 list. The project put together a list of independent news outlets, and it's by no means exhaustive, but it's consists of outlets that over the years we've consistently sourced stories from. And you can find that that link on our website is just a link at the footer of the homepage to independent news outlets, and it's organized thematically, and it has some background and also links to organizations doing critical media literacy education. And I would recommend that source to people if they're interested in expanding their news diet to include some things other than the kind of the junk food on offer from the cable news networks and the TV news stations, especially.
Well, that's a great recommendation. And what we'll do is we'll include a link directly so people can find that in the article that goes with the podcast. But let's take a quick commercial break. Unfortunately, we live in a transactional world. So here we go, folks, some ads. We'll be right back. And we are back to continue the conversation with Andy Lee Roth. He is the Associate Director of Project Censored. So, Andy, of the 25 underreported stories, roughly half of them have a direct impact on the environment. And one of the ones that was interesting to me, and it's something we've talked a little bit about on Earth 911, is how many new chemicals go unregulated. You know, the United States, the world is bombarded by new chemical compounds every year, which don't get thorough reviews before they're included in products and get into the environment. Tell us about what the Neil Betty, Sharon Lerner, and Kathleen McGrory explained about how the Environmental Protection Agency and chemical industry are responsible for causing the United States to be a global laggard in chemical regulation. How did we get here?
Yeah, props to those reporters at ProPublica for breaking this story and alerting us, the members of the public, to it. Essentially, this is a story of regulatory failure. That's what Michael Friedhoff, the EPA's head of chemical regulations, conceded, blaming in part the agency's inability to do its job owing to barriers created by the Trump administration. But what ProPublica found was there are broader issues at play. Yes, the throttling of the EPA and other agencies under the Trump administration was a real factor. But through interviews with environmental experts, and the ProPublica team researched 50 years worth of legislation, lawsuits, EPA documents, oral histories, databases, and so forth. They found basically there's been long-standing institutional failure to protect Americans from toxic chemicals. And this is a complex story that I won't try to do all full justice to in our conversation now. This is maybe a good time for me to plug that all these stories are not only included in this year's State of the Free Press 2024 yearbook, but they're available on the Project Censored website, and anyone who wants to dive into the details of this or any of the other stories we're talking about, they can go to Project Censored and find these stories and the sources of the stories on the website. Just to say a little bit more about this, one of the problems has been that the EPA can't keep pace with the sheer number of new chemicals that they're supposed to assess each year. There's a lengthy assessment protocol. There's also all kinds of industry resistance to that process. And so, it's hard. Like I thinking personally about this story, like on one hand, we trust and hope that the EPA is doing its job. On the other hand, when you read a report like this one, you begin to have sympathy for people at the EPA for whom the job is almost an impossible task, given the sheer volume of investigations that need to be conducted and the resistance by the very industry that's under oversight to that process. So this is a tough story.
And this story is going to get tougher because of a court case before the Supreme Court right now, which may revoke what's known as the Chevron doctrine that allowed the EPA to act and regulate, amongst other things, chemicals. So to some extent, isn't it kind of falling on us, just as citizens who are now bereft of that regulatory protection, to figure this out for ourselves? And that's the question I was thinking about as I was reading this report, which is, with AI, is there a way to mine federal filings to better track these unregulated chemicals? Could we do that? Could the independent press, or could we fund an independent press to do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think you see ProPublica showing it, that things like this can be done, right? When I rattled off all the sources that this team looked at, it's astonishing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe no one citizen can do that, but certainly, my training as a sociologist and my experience working with Project Censored only reinforces my sense that when people come together and decide they're going to work on a problem, amazing things can be accomplished, even in the face of powerful industry resistance and influence. So yeah, I'm not the right person to answer that question in any detail, I think, Mitch, because I don't know enough about how AI actually works. But we definitely have colleagues of mine who serve as judges, for instance, who are, for instance, freedom of information experts.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what they spend their time doing is figuring out how to make information that the government otherwise wouldn't reveal to the public, how to make it publicly accessible. And I think I can imagine a response to this kind of story that would be the coming together of people with experts in AI, people with FOIA expertise and experience, journalists, maybe even some sociologists, to do just the kind of thing you're talking about. I mean, again, this brings back to kind of the core reason that Project Censored exists. I love to burrow into the details of these stories, but sometimes it's good to pull back and talk about the core reason the project exists is based on the premise that a well-informed public makes for a more robust democracy. Mm-hmm. And building from that premise, the idea of putting out a story list every year is twofold from my point of view. One is each of these stories is independent, is important in its own right. But the other thing is the cumulative database that the project has established since 1976 25 stories a year for 48 years. We now have something like 1,200 top 25, censored, important but underreported news stories. And we can begin to see specific patterns of kinds of stories that are systemically neglected or distorted or blockaded by the corporate news media. And of course, the kind of environmental stories that are the focus of our conversation today and Earth911's work in general are prominent in that kind of in that listing of stories that don't get the attention they deserve from the corporate news media. And I think that has everything to do with conflicts of interest. The corporate news media are premised on and reflect a corporate worldview. And so the depredation of the environment, I think personally, is largely to be put at the doorstep of corporate entities. And then the other thing is going back to this theme of what goes wrong every day. A lot of environmental stories don't have single dramatic moments, a Bhopal disaster or East Palestine or whatever. There are those moments, of course, but a lot of the stories that affect everyday people on an everyday basis are stories of what's going wrong every day, right? 200 million Americans live within close proximity to chemical processing and storage treatment plants that regularly release dangerous chemicals into the atmosphere. That's an everyday grinding problem, not something. It doesn't lend itself to the dramatic news photograph that makes an above the fold headline story.
Well, my experience as a reporter, and going back even 30 years, when I used to have to subscribe to the Federal Register in paper, we got it daily at Map Week and at another publication I worked at. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the information is there. It's being published in the Federal Register, but no one digs into it. And to the question of could we use AI to just mine that information, and after training it against the 25 or the 1,200 stories that you've already cataloged, it could begin to say, these are symptoms of what you have already identified as a problem. And so there, even though we are now awash in information, we may actually beginning to be to have access to tools that will help us to dig through it in order to identify what's that daily problem that we really need to be paying attention to, rather than the big smoke story.
This will sound like a kind of trite insight, but I think it's deep nonetheless. A lot of the stories, every year I can point to stories in our top 25 list where a journalist has done something that an independent investigative journalist has simply connected the dots between two things that people, we know both of these things, but we've never seen them connected before. Right. And sometimes it's using the most kind of mundane sources of data. I won't go into detail on this story, but one of our top stories is how big tech companies are increasingly hiring former US intelligence and Israeli intelligence officers to do the work of big tech. That's a story that Alan McLeod reported. His key sources for that story, LinkedIn. Right? You just have to watch the job listings. He just looked at what people listed as their current and former jobs, and he suspected that this was happening based on things that people had told him, sources had told him. But the way he verified it and came up with, I think, a substantively backed story was using LinkedIn and other job networking platforms to identify these hiring patterns. So that's I think the same kind of thing, the same sensibility. This is why we need independent investigative journalism, right? There's a sensibility there that I think, it's not to say that there aren't good reporters doing solid investigative work at the country's major newspapers. Of course they are. But they work in an institutional, organizational context that puts constraints on them that requires that has expectations of how they work and who they talk to that are different from their independent counterparts. And I
Well,
think
and
that's
how
why,
much they produce too.
yes.
They have to churn it out, where a lot of the independent organizations can spend some really good, deep time on a story.
Yeah, I mean the amount of time that ProPublica invested in the toxic chemicals story that we were talking about a moment ago, that was a significant investment by that organization and by those individual reporters to put that story together. Um, but that again, like that, I think it's ironically, it's the stuff that happens, the stuff that goes wrong every day requires that kind of intensive investigation to document the full scope of it in a way that it's much easier to send someone out with a camera and have the big plume of toxic
There you
smoke
go.
at East Palestine and file a report.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that is a great way to tee up your number one story, which is an everyday problem. And that is the continuing use of PFAS, per and poly-fluoroalkyl substances. We've written about it a lot on Earth911 over the years, but this report found that all rainwater contains PFAS now. And there's the quote, "It's no longer safe to drink rainwater anywhere on Earth." Tell us about the story, who broke it, and where can people learn more about it?
So we actually have this story from Insider, which many people will know as Business Insider. They
Yeah.
recently rebranded and now they're simply Insider. But
Mhm.
Business Insider is a like whatever they're calling themselves, they're still a business-oriented news
Yeah.
outlet. And Morgan McFall Johnson reported this story in August 2022. This story is actually based on research that was done at Stockholm University and ETH Zurich, a research organization in Switzerland, based on reporting that was done in the peer-reviewed journal Environmental Science and Technology.
Mhm.
So credit is probably due across the board here, not just to Business Insider or Insider, but also to the scientists who did the research. They basically sampled water all over the world, rainwater, groundwater, and what they found is that the levels of those PFAS often greatly exceeded the strictest international guidelines for acceptable levels of those, I'll try to say it now, perfluoroalkyl acids, right? Um,
I spent 6 months learning to say it.
and we actually had a long editorial discussion when we were working on this story about the differences between PFOAs and PFOSs, right?
Mhm.
I won't try to navigate that technical stuff right now. But I can say for people who haven't necessarily heard about PFAS talked about this way before, the reason they're known informally as forever chemicals is that they take an incredibly long time to break down, which means they accumulate in our environment, in animals, and also in our bodies.
Mhm.
And so the finding and when they accumulate in human bodies, at least, we know they're linked to a number of crucial health issues, including a variety of cancers, um, developmental delays in children, decreased fertility in men and women, reduced vaccine efficacy, and the list goes on. So the finding that these are in rainwater and generally in water around the world is deeply disturbing. Now, someone critical might say, well, look, most of us drink water that's been run through some sort of municipal treatment, and so why should we worry? Um,
No.
but of course, rainwater lands on the crops that we eat, and a huge number of people around the world are still dependent on rainwater as their primary source of drinking water.
Well, moreover, even that filtered water, if it's gone through a municipal system, is often found that the EPA this year found that 47% of tap water in the United States contains PFAS. So this is the question I was thinking about, and it has to do with how do you get the big plume stories that we were talking
Uh-huh.
about before that shine attention on environmental abuse. And I'm wondering if you think that the rise of climate and pollution related suits, such as the recent and successful Held versus Montana case where teenagers sued for a clean environment, which is guaranteed by the Montana Constitution. There's the Juliana case, which started in Seattle and is continuing to work its
Yeah.
way through the courts. And now Multnomah County in Oregon, where Portland is located, has filed a case against fossil fuel companies. Do these lawsuits potentially create the news events that are actually going to get us to pay attention in detail to some of these issues?
Yeah. I wouldn't want that to be the only strategy in our toolkit.
Yeah.
But I think it is certainly one component of it that at some level, regardless of how, speaking as an advocate now, regardless of how those cases come out, the very fact that they're being brought is potentially newsworthy. And the beautiful thing when you think about news coverage of a lawsuit is, so journalists, as you know, Mitch, journalists think in terms of stories that have clear developmental points in them. If a story is going to have legs, it
Yeah.
needs to have a developing story arc. Legal cases are perfect because there are distinct and predictable steps in the story's arc, right? There will be evidence will be heard, witnesses will be called, et cetera, et cetera. Each of those provides.
There's a drama. There's a drama that the writer can use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And each of those provides a distinctive phase in the development of the story that has, in effect, a built-in news hook.
Yeah.
And so I think that is. I think from everything that I learned when I was studying kind of the sociology of journalism in grad school says to me that is good for coverage of these kinds of issues because it sets it up in an institutional setting with a trajectory that is familiar to working journalists, right? There will be journalists whose beat it will be to cover the court. The flip side of that is like if we want actual results in those court cases, the stacking of the courts with conservative judges is a problematic reality to acknowledge.
But these stories give us the opportunity to see the impact of that court packing too.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. Right. Again, the visibility, I think, is a core problem. I mean, I think of this in terms of there being a supply and a demand side of why Americans are not as well informed on some of these issues as they ought to be if we want to have a robust democracy. And some of that is on the supply side, if news outlets simply aren't covering this, but some of it is on the demand side. There's more hunger for junk food news than there is for complex reporting about the PFAS chemicals in and what they do to our bodies and how they're being put into the environment in the first place.
I think for about a year and a half, I would watch and I took screenshots of the CNN homepage. And when there were big bad stories, there were a whole lot more celebrity stories on the page too.
Yeah.
And to your point, the junk news is what a lot of people gravitate to, partly because they don't want to look at the reality of the world we're in. And that's the thing that comes through as I read your report, which is there's a lot of effective news reporting going on. Obviously, we need more, but it's on us to then take the next step. And a lot of people at this point seem to be thinking someone else will take care of it.
Yeah.
How do we change that?
I think we have to cultivate a hunger and appetite for independent journalism. Mickey Huff and I talk about this in the introduction to this year's book by trying to revive the tradition of muckraking that was in its full flower in the early part of the 20th century, when it was incredibly profitable for the news barons of the time to have muckrakers on their staff. And there was an appetite for stories that exposed abuses of power. And that golden era of muckraking didn't really come to an end until World War I broke out, and just basically, I'll be biased in how I formulate this now, basically distracted Americans from domestic problems by focusing their attention overseas. Now, I don't want to be heard as saying Americans shouldn't care about what happens abroad, but for some of the issues that we've been talking about today, the connections between what happens in our local communities and what happens globally are pretty compressed. The chains on those links are not very long. Or the links on those chains are not very long. And so I think there is a connection there. And so, yeah, Mickey and I write about like, what would it take to kind of revive Americans' appetite for a 21st century muckraking journalism. And we say kind of tongue in cheek, like, this might harness, there's clearly an appetite for scandal, right? For news about scandal. And, most of that is focused on celebrities and sports stars and the like. But what if we harnessed some of that in service of reporting on important issues like the ones we've been talking about this morning? Wouldn't, I don't know that is the answer, and I wouldn't want to rely on it as a single answer, but I do think there's something to a revival of that muckraking spirit, which engaged Americans. And as the project's founder, Carl Jensen, who wrote some about the history of that early muckraking journalism, he's very clear. I'll actually just read a little bit we quote in the book. He's very clear that the consequences of that muckraking journalism led, and this is in Carl Jensen's words now in his book, Stories That Changed America, muckraking journalism led to a nationwide public revolt against social evils and a decade of reforms in antitrust legislation, the electoral process, banking regulations, and a host of other social programs. So again, I don't want to pin too much on any one kind of initiative, but cultivating, right, insofar as journalists can connect with a public in terms of saying, look, there's wrongdoing and you should be upset about this.
And you can change it. And you can change it.
Yes, that's crucial, right? I mean, that's the crucial point that I think Carl was making in Stories That Changed America, was it wasn't just that muckraking journalism was profitable for newspaper barons in the 1910s and 20s, or that it led to, a best-selling book series for one or more of the muckrakers, but that it led to fundamental social change, institutional change, regulation and reform in government oversight of some of these issues. And I think we're in dire need of that today. The trick, I think, is how do you convince a public that is perhaps with some justification, increasingly cynical about every institution that we're talking about in this equation, right? We've talked this morning about journalism, about science, about government regulatory bodies and universities, right? And so this leads to, one new wrinkle I might add to, and I think this picks up actually, maybe it's not an entirely new wrinkle for this conversation, is one of the things and this is something systemic across years of Project Censored Top 25 lists, corporate news media don't do a good job of covering solution stories.
Right. Well, that requires that somebody advocate for change, and that's basically controversial. So controversial that you make that decision.
Right. So that's a trouble area for journalists, but there is no shortage of communities coming together and acting effectively, to communities defined on a variety of scales, acting collectively to address systemic problems that face them. And I'm not a classroom teacher anymore, but when I would always ask my students, what news sources do you pay attention to?
Yeah.
And some of the honest ones would say, Andy, I don't read the news. I don't watch the news. It's too depressing.
Mhm.
And I would say that might be a problem with the kind of news you're accessing, right?
Yeah. Well, that
Maybe
news tells you that you're kind of stuck in this rather than it points to
stuck
the
and a helpless bystander,
yeah.
and but you're going to get burned nonetheless.
Mhm.
Um, and so I started getting proactive about I actually started, I created an assignment for my introduction to sociology class where I encouraged them to look at news stories from the Solutions Journalism News Tracker or from Yes Magazine, which has been a pioneer in the United States of solutions journalism. And there's no shortage of positive stories. They just aren't getting aired.
Yeah.
So I think without contradicting myself, I want simultaneously, my vision would be a muckraking journalism that taps into people's desire for salacious scandal, but in service of public goods and public interests, not celebrity gossip. And on the other hand, I want a brighter, broader spotlight put on those solutions stories and I think some of the court cases that you're talking about fit in
Mhm.
that rubric.
Yeah, I believe so too.
We have one, our number 16 story this year is about municipalities in Puerto Rico suing fossil fuel giants under RICO laws, the organized crime laws. I love that story for that twist, right? So that's another example of kind of an innovative way of thinking about this problem that harnesses the power of the courts. I'm not optimistic about how that case is going to play out, but I think it's really like it's brilliant PR to go after Shell, ExxonMobil, and Chevron under laws that were created in I think the 1970 to tackle organized crime, the
Yeah.
mafia, right? And it's not just a stunt. It's the idea is that those companies have colluded to deceive us about the impact of fossil fuel products on the
Well,
climate.
the
And
RICO laws are designed to address a cartel. It's just a different form of.
exactly right. And collusion to deceive falls under the purview of those laws. So I think that's a kind of brilliant thing that I don't, that story has been basically ignored by the establishment press. Again, I think corporate interests explain the lack of coverage. But for a public eager for kind of let's have a focus on scandal and abuses of power, this seems like an eminently rich story to me.
Mhm.
And again, a story that has a potential solution to it if uh, you know, if the plaintiffs can convince the judge in the course that this is legit.
Well, Andy, the Project Censored Underreported Stories series is an incredibly important way for us to remind ourselves on an annual basis of this. And I want to thank you for spending time with us today. How can folks learn more and get the book?
Yeah. You can go to our website, which is simply projectcensored.org. I'll laugh as I say this, but Project Censored has a presence on all the familiar social media outlets. So if you're accessing news that way, or at least partly that way, you can find us there. The project also has a weekly radio show that is syndicated across the country and available on most podcast platforms on demand. And then, of course, I'll just shamelessly plug the yearbook, sales of which support our programs for critical media literacy for students in classrooms. So any and all of those are ways to dig deeper and support what we're doing at the same time.
Well, I hope that our listeners jump in and learn more and support this important work. Thank you, Andy, for spending time with us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Mitch. Thank you for featuring the project on Earth911.
That was my conversation with Andy Lee Roth. He's the Associate Director of Project Censored, and you can learn more at projectcensored.org. Project Censored is all one word, no space, no dash, projectcensored.org. I'm not going to offer a lot of thoughts on this because I think we had a very comprehensive discussion. And as you can hear, news and reporting can be a vital part of our society, but we're in crisis, just as we're in crisis in so many other aspects of our lives, of our relationship with the planet, of our relationship with one another. And it is time for us to look to local reporting. Local reporting doesn't just mean small town or a specific city and talking about what's going on in that, but local in the context of how industries affect different localities and their relationship with the rest of the global economy, for just one of the many ways in which we have to start to rethink how we tell stories about what's happening to us as a society in an incredibly deeply connected world. And so, folks, we'll continue to bring Andy back each year for these conversations, but we'll also try as best as possible to deliver the kind of news that you need in order to be better informed. And I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast or any of the other interviews we've done on sustainability in your ear with your friends, your family, or your coworkers. If you take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, that will help your neighbors find us. Folks, you're the amplifiers that help us spread more ideas so we create less waste. So tell folks you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of their favorite purveyors of podcast goodness. Thanks for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Let's talk about this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.